It's 1:10, time for Any Questions, introduced by Jonathan Dimbleby.
Welcome to Bath, which is a World Heritage City, and I say this with all the objectivity of a local resident, one of the most beautiful in Britain, and especially at this time of year. We're here as the guests of the Bath Festival, one of the oldest and yet the freshest and most imaginative in the land, and it's not to be missed. On our panel, in the 18th century Guildhall in Bath, Wiiliam Waldegrave, who was Secretary of State for Health and Minister of Agriculture, as well as being a Fellow of All Souls, before his present incarnation as Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Margaret Hodge was the leader of Islington Council when it was described by some newspapers as loony left. She entered Parliament in a by-election 2 years ago and is now a member of Jack Straw's Home Affairs team, chairing Labour's task force on under-fives policy. Carmen Callil was born in Australia, where she briefly attended the same convent as Germaine Greer. It must have been equally formative. She came to England and soon established the phenomenally successful feminist publishing house Virago in 1972, stepping down from the chairmanship there last year. This year, she chairs the Booker Prize for Literature. Peter Hitchens was once a Trotskyist, but is now, by his own account, a reactionary, who writes what he describes as a trenchant column for the Daily Express. Recently, he expressed an interest in the past political opinions of Cherie Blair, advertising for information about her in various newspapers. As a result, he complains, people ring him up to say they want to beat him to pulp. Anyway, so far he survived to become the fourth member of our panel. Could we please have our first question?
Eileen Brannan. What opportunities and threats does the panel see in the election of the new right-wing Israeli Prime Minister?
Bibi Netanyahu, who won 50.4% of the vote. The Labour Party was second, Mr. Perez, with 49% of the vote. Minister, you were a foreign minister, went to Israel and actually caused quite a stir there by suggesting that the Palestinians had several rights, I seem to remember some time ago. What's your view of the opportunities or threats of this outcome?
Well, I spent a week, 10 days in Israel as Bibi Netanyahu's guest. He was my exact opposite number. He was the deputy foreign minister. And this was at a time when I, representing the British government, were very much in conflict with the policies of the then Israeli government under Mr. Shamir. And we were arguing, along with a good many other governments around the world, that Israel should respond to the overtures that were then being made by the PLO, and above all, to Yasser Arafat's renunciation of violence, which was a key moment. So at that time, we were in conflict with the then policy of Israel. We were strongly supportive, and are, I think, as everybody is, I think, in the British Parliament, of the steps that Mr. Rabin and Mr. Perez have been making to get a real peace dialogue going. Now, opportunities and threats, and I believe there are both in Mr. Netanyahu's election. He is a highly intelligent man, a formidable man in his way. He is not to be underestimated. The threat is, of course, easier to identify in that he has the support of quite a lot of the most unbending and reactionary of the elements in Israel, and some of the religious fundamentalists who talk only of the land of Israel and can imagine no kind of compromise or negotiation. And that will be a threat, because I suspect that he will have aroused some expectations amongst those people, and those people's expectations cannot be met if peace is to be found, because the trading of land for peace must be part of the process. But there is an opportunity. Remember that it was Mr. Begin who established peace with Egypt. In some respects, it is easier, I believe, if a government in Israeli terms led from the right or from the nationalist wing were to make further steps for peace, because that would take the whole country with him. So I do believe there is an opportunity if he, as he has been saying carefully in the last few days, remains committed to a peace process. Peace with security, he says, well, no one will quarrel with that. Israel has her right to security. So I wish him well, and believe that we may be surprised, or that some people may be surprised, and that they'll find him much more practical and pragmatic than some of his critics have foretold.
Carmen Callil.
Well, I would much rather a right-wing government that told the truth and did what it said it was going to do than a left-wing government that didn't. Therefore, I'm very glad he won. I think the outlook for peace in the Middle East is now extremely grim, because I think the Likud and those sort of Israelis represent what is actually the basic problem in the Middle East, which is an absolute refusal to come to terms with the fact that they wronged the Palestinians and must be generous towards them and must have a peace treaty that gives them some land and gives them citizenship again of their own country. I don't think the current peace discussions that Arafat has agreed are at all good for the Palestinians, and I think what we were doing was preparing for a future of terrible wars as the children grew up full of fury for what their fathers had agreed to. So though I think we are going to have very, very bad times now, I think because it's the truth of the matter, and we're going to have an Israeli government that actually represents what they basically think, an Israeli government that at the moment possesses lands they have no right to in the Golan Heights, southern Lebanon. Every single country in the world has agreed that they should not be in southern Lebanon. They're not only there, they bomb it. And I think now, because we've got people who, a party, the Likud, who presumably are going to represent that real truth about Israeli culture, the confrontation will be real and not pretense, and that there may be some hope when they reach the end of this that a real settlement will come.
Margaret Hodge.
Well, I feel the threats are greater than the opportunities tonight, and we'll have to wait and see. And I'm rather surprised by Carmen saying that it's somebody who tells the truth, because what we know of Netanyahu, we don't know whether he really wants peace. If he wants peace, there will have to be compromise on perhaps the three key issues. One, whether or not there's a Palestinian state, and he said he doesn't want one. Secondly, on the future of Jerusalem. And thirdly, on whether or not there should be more settlements. Now, if he was telling the truth on those, that he would never allow a divided Jerusalem, he'd never allow a Palestinian state, and he will set up some more settlements, it's very bad for the future prospects of peace.
Are you with Wiiliam Waldegrave in thinking that he may not be, that may just be the rhetoric of getting to power, and that when he comes to power he may behave?
Well, I hope, I really, really, really hope that he will prove to be a pragmatist in the same way that Begin was, and I think we've got to wait and see whether that happens. I don't know how, I mean, he's an untried number. He's never run anything. He's clearly very successful at the publicity. He did very well in the States. As I understand it, his last real job was working for a furniture company as their public relations director. We've no idea how he'll cope in this incredibly tense situation in the Middle East. But I do hope that he will be a pragmatist, and I do hope he will compromise. Irreconcilable differences need strong leadership towards compromising, and I hope that he'll do that.
Peter Hitchens.
It's been wonderful to watch fashionable conformist opinion getting itself into a state about Bibi Netanyahu. He's right-wing, which automatically in BBC speak means bad. And the reaction of the news programs on the night when Labour appeared to have won of unashamed joy, the blatant intervention of Bill Clinton trying to save himself through an Israeli election.
He's not on the BBC.
Indeed I am. And the blatant intervention of Bill Clinton, the whole attitude of fashionable opinion has been, this man is wrong, and that he's going to endanger peace. Well, it seems to me that history shows that those who talk most about peace are not necessarily those in whose hands it is safest. One remembers Neville Chamberlain, who never stopped going on about peace. The word peace has always seemed to me to be a danger sign. Peace in our time means war next year. And here you have a conflict, not of peace and war, but of realists and fantasists. The trouble with Shimon Peres is that in Middle Eastern terms, he was a fantasist. He treated the Middle East like Europe. Israel is surrounded by incredibly dangerous neighbors, bought off in the case of Egypt by enormous subventions from the United States, based on incredibly unstable regimes. It's tiny, and it is not and will never be a normal country. Mr. Waldegrave and I went round together the Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem, which details why Israel exists. It's a museum of the Holocaust. It is the one place where Jews can go when there is nowhere else, and it is under constant military threat. A tank can cross it at its narrowest point in 18 minutes, and a jet plane in that many seconds. So, it requires a serious leader. I think Bibi Netanyahu is a much more serious leader than Shimon Peres and should have been given a great deal more credit by those in the West who are now stumbling over themselves to pay him compliments they didn't while he was running for election.
Do you believe Shimon Peres, Wiiliam Waldegrave, was a fantasist?
No, I had a considerable respect for Shimon Peres, but and indeed for Rabin, because this was not an argument about the right of Israel to security. It's an argument about what is the best way of securing long-term security for that absolutely vulnerable country, incredibly vulnerable, as Peter says. I've always believed that it was possible to make a long-term peace, even with Syria. Syria was always going to be the last to come to an agreement. But I don't think it is necessarily wrong to say that at this moment, a tough and a strong leader, bringing with him the other half of the Israeli electorate, because it's divided exactly down the middle, maybe what is needed to take the process forward to conclusion.
Margaret Hodge.
I mean, I have to say this the fact that he's right-wing and it therefore seems to see bad is absolutely absurd. I don't know where Peter gets that from at all. It's not a question of right-wing, left-wing. It's whether or not somebody is committed to the peace process. There is another ingredient we haven't touched on, and that's the Knesset itself. And we're in a new situation. This was a new election. We had both an election of Prime Minister, election of the Knesset. The composition of the Knesset now has many more religious groups there. It's the Russian immigrants who we don't know quite how that's going to play out. And I don't know if he's a tough leader. You two have met him. I don't think he's an unknown quantity. I hope he is genuinely committed to the peace process. A lot of what he said before didn't suggest that. We all want him to, in practice, implement that.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Keith Collins. In the light of Kenneth Clarke's criticism of press distortion on Europe and his assertion that tabloid papers are edited by anti-Europeans, do members of the panel believe Britain may be driven out of the European Union by media campaigns?
Do I take it so that you yourself are not comfortable with some of the reporting and coverage and attitudes of some of the newspapers?
I'm not at all happy with some of the tabloid press comments at all.
Carmen Callil.
Yes, well, I read the tabloids this week and felt equally nauseated. My view is that, thank God, the people of Britain are not necessarily influenced by the sort of racist rant they read about Europe in the tabloid press. And therefore, I don't think we need to worry about it as much as Ken Clarke suggests. If it was true, I can't think what we can do about it. We live in a free society. We love to read The Sun and look at the woman with her bare tits every day, and then we turn to their leader columns and also to the sort of thing that Peter says, and read and listen to terrible remarks made about people across the channel. And really, I have to say, I think it's up to us to object. If we don't like it, we've got to show those newspapers we don't. Otherwise, it's just going to go on and on. But to get back to the question, I think that the British people are too sensible to leave for that reason. I'm not saying they won't leave, because it seems to me there are things that they've made such a tremendous fuss about being part of it that perhaps they should leave, I think. And then they can make a tremendous fuss about not being a part of it. But I don't think that they will be influenced by the newspapers.
Thank you. Wiiliam Waldegrave.
Well, I think we've got to be a little bit careful about being so superior about what are written in newspapers and freely bought by millions of our fellow citizens. I mean, statistically, if I asked the audience to put up their hands, and all the people truthfully put up their hands who bought tabloid-sized newspapers, it would be the great majority of people in the audience.
Hold on a moment.
But it has to be so.
Hold on a second,
Yeah.
we'll ask them. Here, we've got 500-600 people in here. Put up your hands, those of you who buy tabloid newspapers.
Mail, Express.
Any of the tabloid newspapers, the ones that aren't broadsheets. Hands up who do.
The Mail on Sunday.
Hands up
Sunday
who.
Express.
Hang on, be quiet, William, for a second. Hands up those who are not saying they do but actually do. All right, there's half a dozen apparently here. Sorry, Mr. Waldegrave, continue.
Well, we've either proved something about the statistics of the audience or that they're even more discreet than I thought. Because nobody is actually compelled to buy the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or even the Sun. It is a voluntary act. So that it is possible that what is written in those newspapers actually bears some relation to what people want to read. Now, because they're very commercial, the people who run these newspapers. Now, of course, none of this excuses racialism or xenophobia or all the rest of it, but I think there is a real current of unease in this country at the moment about the European Union. And if people don't recognize that, then they're not recognizing something very important. Now, I'm a supporter of Britain's membership of the European Union. I think there are great benefits to be had from the European countries working together properly. But I also think that we are now getting out into the open for the first time really in this country, the unspoken argument, which hasn't been fully had out in public in this country, as to what kind of Europe we want. We don't, I think the majority of people in this country, the opinion polls and my own experience would show, want a united federal Europe. There are many people in the rest of the European community who do. And at some point, this country's got to make up its mind about that. Now,
is that whether they want effectively Kenneth Clarke's Europe or John Redwood's Europe?
Kenneth Clarke's Europe is on this fundamental point exactly the same as John Redwood's Europe. That is a Europe based on the sovereign nation states. And that is what I think we voted for, and that is what we want. Now, I believe passionately that we can still get that kind of Europe, and that we shouldn't walk away, we shouldn't take our bat away and say the game's up. We can get that kind of devolved Europe with the ultimate power resting in the national parliaments. And I want to stay in the community and fight as hard as I can for that, because there's great good to Britain for creating and maintaining that kind of Europe.
Peter Hitchens.
There's a small but influential class of people in this country who actually don't really very much like Britain or the British or its institutions, and who want very much to change it, and who see in the European Union a way of doing so. They confuse Europe, a continent of many varied countries with many admirable characteristics, with the European Union, a nascent superstate which hopes to dominate us all from a mist-girt concrete office block in the Low Countries. And I think those of us who are not enthusiastic about the European Union are entitled to distinguish between the two. And those of you who disagree with us are entitled to understand that there is a huge difference between loving your own country and hating other people. And we have been lectured this week by many people, including even Conservative members of Parliament, about alleged xenophobia. We are not xenophobic. We have nothing against foreigners. We are not afraid of foreigners. Europe, on the other hand, is a hotbed of xenophobia. The country which is the home of the European Union, Belgium, is divided bitterly between two different groups, the Flemings and the Walloons. Only this week, the German finance minister actually had the nerve to say that the Czechs ought to apologize for the way they treated the Sudeten Germans after the Second World War. The Czechs should apologize to the Germans after the Second World War. These festering hatreds and dislikes boil across Europe. They erupted recently in Yugoslavia. They have absolutely no comparison with the feeling which British people have that their 1,000 years of tradition and institutions are different from those of Europe, made even more different by the fact that we were the one country to escape invasion, subjugation, and dictatorship during the Second World War, and we wish to preserve them.
Do you think
if anybody cannot now tell the difference between patriotism and xenophobia, see me afterwards.
Well, despite that very clear statement of your view of the distinction, do you not think the questioner has a point when he suggests that, as Carmen Callil said, that some of the stuff in the tabloid press has been, I can't remember the term that Carmen used, but disgusting or something like that, nauseating?
No, I think the most nauseating remark that's been made all year on the subject of Europe was made by Chancellor Kohl in his speech in Leuven in February, in which he said approximately that if Germany were not allowed to dominate Europe through the European Union, then there might be another war. I thought, coming from a German leader, that was the most astonishing and outrageous remark. And I think it was the beginning of a lot of what we've seen since. And I think comparing that to any of the little jokey remarks against Germans made in any newspaper is to miss the point.
Chancellor Cole is, of course, if he wishes to correct that interpretation of what he says, welcome to ring into any answers after the Saturday edition of any questions, or indeed any of the rest of you. The number to ring is 0171 580 4444. On this, Margaret Hodge.
Well, I actually agree with Wiiliam Waldegrave on this one. I think our national interest is in Europe, and I think there are some difficult negotiations that rest before us over the coming months as to how we ensure we protect that national interest. The national interest is there partly because of our economic interest, the jobs, the exports, partly because actually the European Union has meant that there hasn't been a European war for 50 years, and we want to keep that peace going. But there is a difference between xenophobia and patriotism. We're all patriotic. And the pride in nation is very important. It's very important for the strength of a community that you should have a pride in the locality in which you live. But you can go over the edge and become xenophobic. And a lot of the papers this last week or so have become xenophobic. And I have to say, and I would put it to Wiiliam, and it's a challenge tonight, I think one of the worst bits of xenophobia we saw was actually Gillian Shepherd in her remark that we shouldn't be playing Beethoven's Ode for Joy at the European Championship. I would just ask that Wiiliam should dissociate himself as another member of the cabinet with that and say before he comes back on that, we had Beethoven's Fifth Symphony all through the Second World War as part of the patriotic background to our desire to win that war.
Well, I'm happy to take up that challenge. I think here in the home of the Bath Festival, the idea of taking one of the greatest melodies from perhaps the greatest symphony and using it as a jingle for a football competition is desecration of great music.
Hang on, but that... Let's, with all gentleness, I say that wasn't quite the point that Gillian Shepherd was making.
Well, it's the point I'm making.
But you were asked, and of course it's up to you to answer or not, you were asked whether or not you dissociated yourself from the view that because it was in Britain, Ode to Joy should not be played as a German tune for Euro 96.
Well, I don't know that Gillian said that, so I'm always unwilling to comment on things that I haven't actually heard firsthand. I can't believe she did, because it would have been an odd thing to say. I think there's a far more fundamental reason for objecting to it, which is it's a trivialization of a serious piece of music.
Oh, Wiiliam, we have to come back on that. I'm sure Carmen wants to as well.
I think it's equally trivial that they use it for the sort of slightly bogus national anthem of the European Union,
well, the
actually.
poor old Ode to Joy has been taken over by the European Union. No one actually knows what it is. It's full of stuff about brotherhood and hanging out and everybody kissing each other. It's actually a perfect European anthem. And not all that inappropriate for the footballers who used to kiss each other as to doing what they seem to do nowadays. But
I think you've all made your points very effectively in their own way, and I'm going to move on to the next question. Please.
Morag Yos. If the panel were to come across a hitherto unknown work by a famous author or composer, for example, another undiscovered screenplay by Jane Austen, whose manuscript would they like to find?
There's been another, of course, which is in Suffolk. The Library of Congress is thought to be the likely buyer for a manuscript discovered in Suffolk, which is thought to be, by Sotheby's, the work of George Washington, a missing fragment from the speech he intended to give, but didn't in the end, as the first American president in 1789. That's really just to give you all a chance to think which of those manuscripts you would most like to find. You can think of any single person who you would love to come across a manuscript by at the Bath Festival. I think you're terribly keen to start. Carmen Callil.
Oh, I knew it'd be me again. And my reply is going to be such a cheat. But the thing is, I don't want to find any more manuscripts at the moment. And I hate sequels to Jane Austen, and I hate people who write, Return to Pride and Prejudice. So I really think that I'm not going to choose anybody. I think everybody writes what they've written, and let's leave it at that.
You wouldn't like to discover a single work from any writer that had not hitherto appeared. Any
Well,
writer,
bitter experience
and later
leads-
a Salman Rushdie that was hidden away in the undergrowth?
No, I really would not. No, no.
Wiiliam Waldegrave.
Well, I spent the first sort of 22 years of my life studying the classics, and this was a game one used to play quite often, and there's one very easy answer to it, to any amateur classicist, which is the rest of Sappho. Sappho produced in the 6th century BC some fragments, is all we have, of what appears to be the greatest lyric poetry that wasn't really written at that level again until, I don't know, perhaps the Romantic Revolution, and it would just be wonderful, as long as what turned up out of the desert sands of Egypt as papyrus, what confirmed it as being as good as what the fragments are. It'd be awfully disappointing if the rest of it was all dreadful, but that would be my easy first choice, and it would be wonderful if the 2 or 3 poems we now had were matched by a corpus of work as good as that. And classicists have this wonderful delight because things do turn up out of the sands of Egypt, preserved miraculously by the dry conditions. Whole new fragments of plays by Aeschylus and so on. And in spite of what Carmen says, it is very exciting when that happens.
Thank you. Margaret Hodge.
I'm going to be greedy now because Wiiliam made me think of another one. I thought poetry, I think probably Sylvia Plath, if one could find some more of her poems, I think they are very powerful and moving. And then I'm going modern on both of these, Jonathan. I think author, I'd go for Primo Levi, who wrote about his experiences in the concentration camps, and I think that's among the most moving experiences in literature I've read in a long, long time, and I've only read it in translation. What it's like in its original Italian, I don't know, but I think it's very powerful.
Peter Hitchens.
Well, I wish Macaulay had finished his History of England, but apart from that, I would quite like to see, and this is a bit mischievous, a speech by any senior figure in the Labour Party saying sorry for getting it wrong over every single major issue of the past 20 years.
Or at least it would be literature.
If you've got any that you would like to turn up, as it were, let us know in any answers, as well as your views on other subjects. We're on to the next question.
John Thackrell, do you think Welsh students at Aberystwyth were justified in demonstrating against an English queen?
The Queen had to cut short her visit to Aberystwyth University when students in favour of the Welsh language protested against her as an English queen opening buildings at the university there. Peter Hitchens.
This is a question of manners, isn't it? You can protest if you like, but the way in which they protested to such an extent that the Queen's bodyguards were afraid of allowing her to proceed with her visit is going too far. People can protest in democracies, but they shouldn't protest in such a fashion. The question of whether she's the Queen of Wales or the Queen of England seems to me to have been settled some long time ago, but those who disagree with that aren't allowed, because they feel strongly, to take it up in that fashion. It goes with what we have to call road rage. It goes with footballers misbehaving in aeroplanes. It goes with the whole coarsening of the society that we now live in, where every kind of unpleasant behavior is now licensed and forgiven and condoned, and seems to me to be destined to get considerably worse before anybody will do anything about it.
Margaret Hodge.
I was going to say I almost agreed with Peter Hitchens on that one until he got to road rage, because I think there's senseless murder, which is what road rage is, of people for absolutely no reason at all, cannot in any way be compared to an unpleasant demonstration.
Well, I wasn't talking about the murder particularly, if you don't mind me saying so. I was talking about the actual phenomenon of people behaving in this unpleasant manner when they're driving their cars.
Our current interest in road rage is because of the 2 recent murders. But I do agree with Peter on the rest of it. And I wondered, clearly he's reformed from his own Trotskyist past when he would have indulged in similar activities. And I wondered whether he was prepared to say he was sorry.
I am.
You have.
I am, I have, and I will. I am sorry. I regret it. I regret it all.
Sorry. He's so profoundly sorry he can say it many, many times. Do you think... I'm not going to go back to the last question. Carmen Callil.
Well, if we've had any coarsening of society, which everybody seems to have noticed except for myself, it can only be laid at the feet of the people who have governed us for the last 17 years.
Meanwhile,
as to the royal family, I speak as an Australian Republican. I cannot understand how the British treat their royal family. It's beyond me. They never seem to have done any of the people any harm, but except, of course, having far too much money. I do see that. But apart from that, I would say that if you're going to have a queen, they're a very good queen to have. And I find, therefore, that if this handling of this Welsh trip was done in the way that one has heard it was done, but once again, I must say I never believe anything I read in newspapers. For example, I do not believe that those footballers really did make bust up those television things on the airplane. I just don't believe it, because I just think it's newspapers needing some circulation. So to get back to the Queen, I think they've got every right to say that she shouldn't come to Wales, but I don't understand why they couldn't do it politely, because I think she has tried to be a very good queen.
Wiiliam Waldegrave.
Well, I'll restrain myself from pursuing Carmen's rather extraordinary argument, A, that there hasn't been any coarsening of society, or that she hasn't noticed it, and then that it's all the fault of the government, which is a lovely, what Chris Patten, your former Member of Parliament, used to call a double whammy. First it didn't happen, and then it's all the government's fault. Going back to the question, if we're allowed to do that, I think it is fundamentally wrong to say that the Queen is the Queen of England. The Queen is the Queen of the United Kingdom. And as a matter of fact, there is Welsh blood in her veins, as there is also Scottish and English and a variety of other European bloods. And she represents above all the unity of our kingdom, which benefits all the peoples, I believe, of the United Kingdom. It certainly benefits the English, but I also think it does benefit the Welsh, the Scottish, the Northern Irish. I only wish British politicians in the 19th century had been more skillful and kept the rest of the Irish with us too, because so many of the greatest people who've come from these British Isles have been Anglo-Irish in one form or another. So I think it would be tragic if that union was broken up. Tragic for all the peoples, because we'd all be impoverished if we went back into smaller nationalistic groups. And so that's my wider feelings. On the behaviour of the students, I don't think it's fair to say that student behaviour's got worse. I have more students in my constituency, I think I'm right in saying, than probably any other in the United Kingdom, in Bristol. And actually, there's far less student trouble now than there used to be when Peter and I were students, and Margaret. They're working very hard, and on the whole, they're very well behaved. So I don't think one should attack the student population on the basis of one extreme demonstration, which was, as somebody rightly said, bad manners, and probably disappointed and irritated very many more people who were present there to see the Queen than the few who then got all the limelight on the television, which is exactly what they wanted, and the television should have more sense than to give them so much coverage.
Our next question, please.
Carol Esquel. Would a nighttime curfew on teenagers work in reducing the crime rate in Britain, as proposed by President Clinton in the United States?
President Clinton was proposing that in New Orleans, where a strict dusk to dawn curfew is already in force. And juvenile crime there has apparently fallen by 27% and car thefts by 42% since it was introduced. The assumption being that there is some correlation between the two. Margaret Hodge.
Well, I've got 4 children, and I'm trying to work out, 2 of them are still teenagers, and the idea of having a nighttime curfew on those is absolutely impossible. I couldn't begin to implement it. I think this is a nonsense. It is a complete and utter nonsense. We have to deal with the issue of youth dissatisfaction and indeed youth crime seriously. And there are a whole string of measures that we can take. Part of them are being tougher on the crime so that we don't have situations like kids doing a sort of minor burglary and then going in and getting a caution in the police station and realizing that nothing much happens after that. So being tough on it, and also being tough on the causes of crime. And that means finding them jobs, making sure that there are proper facilities in terms of youth clubs and activities in which they can engage, and ensuring that you tackle it at both ends. But the idea of a curfew, actually, I find absolutely ridiculous, and I don't think it could possibly be ever implemented in Britain today.
If you lived in New Orleans and your teenagers were picked up, they would be taken to a curfew centre where you would then be urged to join them to take part in group talks of police officers, counsellors, church volunteers, and the rest. Just the facts of the matter. Peter Hitchens.
Well, I went out with the Dallas police into some of the nastier parts of that city on the night that they introduced just such a curfew. And it was very depressing because although they picked up a lot of kids, when they took them home, the places they took them to were not homes. And the people who were supposed to be their parents were either absent, taking drugs, or otherwise useless to them. The problem that is at the root of much of the urban crime in the United States, and the root of much of ours too, is that the family unit, which is the fundamental source of authority, has broken down or is breaking down. What is it now? 1/3 of children born out of wedlock in this country. And you can spend as much money as you like and as much effort as you like putting policemen on streets, and I've no doubt that it's had some sort of effect on New Orleans. But it is only sticking plaster on a much, much deeper problem. And like all of President Clinton's ideas, it's a quick fix designed to help him win the election with no real thought behind it.
Chief Secretary.
Just to complete Peter's transatlantic political commentary, I can't think quite what it reminds me of, but Clinton, who is a sort of centre-left politician, supposedly, keeps pinching ideas from the right as the election comes along and putting them in the shop window. I can't quite think what that reminds me of, but there is something. The idea seems to me to be the sort of thing you have to consider, I suppose, if you've got to the complete crisis that big American cities have got to. Recently in Bristol, they rapidly rescinded it and said there was a muddle. American tourists were given a warning that Bristol, because we did have 5 very unpleasant murders, which some in the audience will remember over the Christmas time, and there was a warning given to American tourists that Bristol was now a very difficult place, dangerous place. We were able to show that Bristol had a crime rate lower than a murder rate lower than the average American village, I have to say. So that the crime rate in New Orleans, I don't have the figures in front of me, which is where Clinton took the idea from, is probably higher than the crime rate for the whole of the United Kingdom. The murder rate will probably be higher than the murder rate for the United Kingdom. Certainly Chicago's is. And that seems to me to be the extent of the crisis they've got to. And if you've got to that crisis, well, I guess you have to try and take extreme measures. But it's a huge infringement of liberty. Thank goodness we don't need it here. If anybody suggested it here, I think they would be given very short shrift. I certainly would not like to explain to my teenage daughters that they were now going to be locked up at night.
At least until...
well, yes, it depends. Yeah,
8, 9,
as soon
10,
as I said
o'clock?
that, I knew I was going to get into trouble somehow.
11 o'clock they're allowed out to at weekends. Hang on, you can in a second, but I'm going to Carmen Callil, and then you'll come back in to defend the proposition.
Well, I think I agree with more or less everybody who's spoken thus far, except the only thing I think a nighttime curfew would be ludicrous. Nothing would make me want to be sick or poor in America. As far as I'm concerned, they should continue to export their movies, but that's it, please.
I'm not sure about all the movies, actually.
Not all the movies, but they're better than ours. And finally, I think that what we have to do is think of ways to look after or help these young people who haven't got a home to go back to by giving them some resources in themselves. And that requires looking at housing, but most of all education, and also some concern and some passion for our greatest inheritance that we have in this country, which is the English language and the literature that is written in it.
Thank you. Margaret Hodge.
I was going to come back on William because clearly we haven't reached the stage of the American cities at the moment, but one of the really frightening things, and this is part of, I have to say, 17 years of Conservative rule, is that we now have massively high levels of youth unemployment. Unemployment among black inner city kids is at, 60% or something like that? They simply can't get jobs. This leads to total alienation. You've had terrific cuts in local authorities and their ability to provide facilities for youth to spend their time. And I'm sure his caseload, as much as mine, is full of people coming to see me because they are being disturbed by kids on the street, particularly in the summer months when you get a lot of vandalism and you've got to get a lot of kids congregating with nothing to do, no purpose in life. And that, I have to say, goes firmly back to the government for their failure to actually run the economy in a way that it creates jobs, and their failure to actually fund sufficiently those facilities and the infrastructure which ensures that youth have a purpose in life.
Okay. First of all, Wiiliam Waldegrave. Wiiliam Waldegrave first, then you, Peter.
If we're doing the party political knockabout, the two countries in Europe which have the highest youth unemployment are Spain and France, which have been ruled for most of the last 2 decades by socialist governments, which have so increased the cost of employing people in those countries that Spain now has overall about 25% of its young people out of work. Now, Britain, recently shown by the international organization, the OECD, is doing better at job creation than any of those other European countries. And if I wanted to put a party political finger on things that are actually much wider and deeper than that, I would say, have a look at the education authorities, which have followed the now renounced, too late renounced by the Labour Party, fashionable education theories in places like Islington, where Margaret Hodge used to run it, which have produced a generation of people who were very difficult to employ.
Peter Hitchens.
Can we please stop patronizing the poor and black people of this country with the assumption that because they are unemployed, they will turn to crime? It is not. It is an insulting insinuation to make, and it simply misses the point that we are talking here about morals, not about money.
You can return to that issue, of course, in any answer. I'll give you the number once more. It's 0171 580 4444 after the Saturday edition of Any Questions. And swiftly to our next question, please.
Vic Heathfield, do magazine pictures of models of anorexic proportions exert a harmful influence on impressionable readers?
This follows, I suppose, the watch company called Omega saying it wouldn't go on advertising in the English Vogue if they went on having these figures, sort of girls' heads and boys' bodies, or something like that. Carmen Callil.
Yes, I think they do, but I think you can't ban them by putting these anorexic matchsticks in. But I think what is wonderful about this particular story is what Omega did. They objected, and it's exactly what I said earlier about we've got to object ourselves if we want anything changed, and Omega did. And I strongly recommend that what they should do is say you can have we'll give you back your advertising, but I want a watch put around the wrist of Sophia Loren or Marilyn Monroe for about a year before, and then you can have our business back. I think young girls are subject to the most terrible persecution almost in the strains and stresses put upon them to be slim, to be thin, not to eat, and to conform to the image that is required of them. I think anything that stops it happening is a good thing, and I think what Omega did was really good.
Thank you. Wiiliam Waldegrave. Wiiliam Waldegrave.
Well, it was brilliant advertising by Omega. We've got their story onto Any Questions for free. Brilliant advertising for the Times, which printed the picture of an incredibly beautiful girl, which was somehow involved in this story, on the front page as the major news story. And it seemed to me all a storm in a something or other cup.
Small cup. Margaret Hodge.
I don't read Vogue. I thought the photographer in the papers was absolutely horrific. Women and men come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and we should celebrate them all for what they are. And let's have more Sophia Lorens. And can I just say one final thing? It's a bit sad that people like Susie Orbach, who sort of does a lot of work in this area, has been saying for a long, long time that celebrating sort of anorexic sort of figures in Vogue is very bad for young teenagers. She gets nowhere. Omega, a commercial interest, immediately withdraw their advertising, and suddenly it becomes an issue. What does that say about the society we live in?
Peter Hitchens, in a word.
It's a long time since I could wear a watch around my waist. My only delight of this week was discovering that most men actually prefer Delia Smith to either plastic Barbies or X-rays. A wonderful woman surrounded by children, the smell of baking bread, and so immensely preferable to these nonsense girls that well, we all know the answer.
Thank you. Next week, Peter Lilly, Gavin Strang, Roger Graith, the filmmaker, and McElvoy of The Spectator. Join us then, but from here in Bath, don't forget any answers. Goodbye.
As you heard, any questions came from Bath, and in the team were Peter Hitchens, the Right Honourable Wiiliam Waldegrave MP, Carmen Callil and Margaret Hodge MP. Jonathan Dimbleby was in the chair, and the producer was Nadine Grieve. And there's a chance to put your views on the subjects discussed in the programme in a few minutes' time by ringing Jonathan now on 0171 580 4444. Now at 5 to 2, the shipping forecast issued by the Meteorological Office at 1305 today. There are warnings of gales in Viking, Northwood Cirra, Hebrides, Bailey, Fair Isle, Faroes and South East Iceland. The general synopsis at 0700. A deep low just north of Faroes, 974, moving slowly northeast and filling 984 by 0700 tomorrow. Low 350 miles west of Seoul, 1013, expected northeast Finisterre, 1013 by the same time. The area forecast for the next 24 hours: Viking, Northwood Cirra, south veering southwest 6 to gale 8, decreasing 5, showers good. Southward Cirra 40s Cromarty, southwesterly 6 or 7, decreasing 4, showers good. Fourth Tyne Dogger, southwesterly 5 or 6, decreasing 4, showers good. Fisher German Bight, southwesterly 4 or 5, decreasing 3, showers good. Humber Thames, southwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 at first, backing south 3, showers good. Dover White, southwesterly 4 or 5, occasionally 6 at first and becoming variable 3, showers good. Portland Plymouth, southwesterly 4 or 5, backing southeasterly 3, showers then occasional rain good. Biscay, westerly, backing southeasterly 3 or 4, occasionally 5 later, showers then rain, moderate or good. Southwest Finisterre,